All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jorge Acosta, and I'm the director of the Statewide Training Initiative with Florida Legal Services. Welcome to our webinar, and I kind of like the name. I don't know if you're familiar with this name, but it's Debí, Tomar, CLEs, Spanish in the Legal Profession and Access to Justice. Now, full disclaimer, this webinar is in English. I know the title starts in Spanish, but this webinar is in English. We may end up doing a Spanish version of it down the road. So before we get started, I'm actually one of the speakers today, so it's going to be a little bit different. So I do want to go through the typical housekeeping items that we have. The training is being recorded, so if you're registered, you're going to receive a copy of the recording from Zoom within 24 hours. We will also be posting it on YouTube. So if you were unable to register, you can find it on YouTube. We're going to include the materials, the CLE code, everything on that email and on the YouTube description as well. The training was approved by the Florida Bar for 1 General CLE and zero point 0.5 ethics credits. I will announce the CLE code towards the end. Actually, on the last slide, I also have that CLE code. It will also go out via email and it will also be on the YouTube description. Closed captions are enabled for anybody who needs them. So if you're having any issues, feel free to drop a message in the chat. I'm also going to try to include my email in the chat just in case. This training is being co-hosted by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, or PILS. So if you're not familiar with PILS, I highly encourage you to look at their website. In that email that I'll send out, I'm going to include information for Florida Legal Services, website, social media links. I'll do the same thing for PILS. So make sure to bookmark those links to follow these organizations on their social media. When it comes to PILS, the membership is about $55 a year, but if you're a law student, it's actually free of charge. So there's a lot of great opportunities to volunteer and learn from other public interest law attorneys. So final piece of housekeeping announcements, questions and answers. So even though this is a webinar format, I'm hoping that towards the end, if anybody wants to speak up, we can take you off mute. You can raise your hand and I can take you off mute if you want to contribute, but be on the lookout for the chat. We're going to be asking the audience to answer some questions. And we're going to have, I guess, some polls as well. So be on the lookout for those. And with all of that said, let me turn my screen here on the other side. So I'm going to kind of introduce myself and my co-host today, Erika. You've probably seen us present before. So Erika Recek, she's the director of the Survivor Advocacy Unit here at Florida Legal Services, and I'm the director of the statewide training initiative here at Florida Legal Services. So Erica and I, we've known each other for what, like 10 years now, and we've worn many hats. And it turns out I included this picture here because we happen to be wearing hats. This was at FAMU at a recent presentation that we had for law students, which was basically this presentation, but law student focused. So I thought it would be fitting to show how we've worn many hats. We've worked at community legal services a long time ago at the helpline. That's how we met. Then I ended up following Erica at Florida Legal Services. And as I said, we've worn many hats from intake to supervising other people to handling multiple areas of law. We've mentioned forming this fake law firm called Horica Law, where we handle consumer and tenant claims. So yeah, we are always having these conversations. We've known each other for a long time. So Erica, did I miss anything here as part of the intros? Anything that you want to add?
No, I like appreciate the background because I think it explains our friendly banter back and forth. If people ever see us, we bicker like brother and sister because we've known each other for so long.
Very accurate. All right, so let's get the presentation started. Let's go into our first topic, which is going to be understanding cultural nuances and impact on client interactions. And I'm going to use one of my favorite icebreakers. I'm going to launch a poll here on Zoom in a second, and I want people to tell me what this is. So this time around, I set this one up as a poll. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it. And I'm sorry if you're hungry. I know it's lunchtime, so I'm showing you pictures of delicious food. For me, there is only one right answer, but this is part of the topic here, right? So I know a lot of people are, what I'm seeing, I feel like a lot of people are giving me the wrong answer already, but I'm not gonna boot you out of this webinar if you give me the wrong answer, but we see a lot of people answering and we have over 68% of people have answered. So if you don't know and if you select other and you think there's another name for this, feel free to drop it into the chat. That's part of what we're doing here today. We're learning. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll in few seconds. So three, two, one. And as expected, I expected people to answer empanada. To me, that's the wrong answer. Like we had 74% of people answer empanada. I'm from Puerto Rico and I'm from the Southwest. So for me, this is an empanadilla. A lot of people will say pastelillo, and I think that's wrong. But to me, it's an empanadilla. Erica, what would you call this?
I would call it an empanada.
So there you go. It's the reason I bring this up is like we sometimes bicker and fight over simple things such as food. So imagine if we start thinking about all this, in legal terms. So another common word that I also love using this other slide, is the word ahorita. Depending on where you're from, it does mean a lot of different things, right? So this is why it's key to kind of know who you're talking to, understand where they're coming from, because one word could make a big difference. So, and I'm gonna bring up some other legal terms for the audience to kind of participate and chime in. But to give you an idea, it's if we are thinking about these simple words, imagining legal terms, how complicated it can be. So, um, I do have some kind of metrics here that Erica and I were discussing earlier. So Erica, I'm going to pass it over to you for this slide.
Sure. So I guess the reason we wanted to do this presentation is to, bring attention and highlight why do we need to talk about this? Why do we need to talk about language access and making services accessible for other individuals? We are a melting pot, and I think Florida even more so. 30.1% of households in Florida report speaking a non-English language primarily in their households. That's higher than the national average of 22%. The highest languages spoken in Florida are Spanish, Haitian Creole, and Portuguese. Florida, there's a growing Spanish speaking population in the US and Florida. I believe Jorge had noted that the 2019 census estimated 26.4% of Florida's population, which is over 5.6 million individuals, identified as Hispanic or Latino, and over 4.8 spoke Spanish in the home. We want to make sure that language access is not an additional barrier. I think generally it's going to be, but the more we highlight the issues, the more we're able to identify and see how we can work together or find common solutions, and make sure that we're being mindful of our ethics as we provide these services. Then hopefully we can at least try to overcome any of those barriers.
Right. So let's kind of throw some legal terms out there. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to go through all these, but this is where you, as the audience, we want to hear from you. So feel free to drop in the chat. If I say filing, if you know any Spanish, how would you say this in Spanish? Like filing in the sense of the verb, like I'm filing a document in court or I'm filing a lawsuit. Maybe, and also if you want to throw in as a bonus, just the word file, like I want to review the client's file because it could have different meanings. So if any of you
As
want to try out, like drop it into the chat, but how would you say it in Spanish? We have archivo, we have remitir, expediente, archivar, repasar el archivo. I love all these. Like Erica and I were having these conversations, and we just kept throwing different words on how would you say filing, Erica, if you were talking to a client in Spanish?
Um, we definitely talked about archivo, and that was like my word and my phrase for how I've described it, or repasar el archivo. I do find myself, even though, so as a little bit of a background, I was born in Peru, but I came here at a young age. So even though Spanish was the very first language I learned, I feel more comfortable speaking in English. In my household, it was my mom and I. So my mom and I would speak Spanish, but predominantly I was speaking English. I grew up in a household with a stepdad that was American, so we didn't speak. He never really learned the Spanish. Like maybe he understood more than what he let on to. I feel like, but we spoke a lot of English in my household, and my mom wanted it that way because she wanted to learn and get familiar with everything. And she was one of the more stubborn individuals that was like, no, talk to me in English, and let me struggle through it. I will say, and I know we're talking about words right now, but I don't think that this is in our slides, but I always try to be respectful for what individuals want as well when I ask if they would like an interpreter. Sometimes you may hear an accent, but it may be an individual that says, no, I would like to proceed in English. And I always want to be respectful of what they need. Ask the questions, identify that this could be a need, but I never force anything upon them. And I think that really started with my mom, because my mom was one of the individuals that was like, nope, talk to me in English. So that being said, I'm mentioning this because a lot of the words that I learned, I use multiple words in Spanish to explain a simple phrase sometimes. And I know that that's my issue. But in terms of filing, I've mentioned archivo as the file in court. Es necesario poner el documento en la corte. It's necessary to put the document into the court. I've used many words for the simple word of filing.
And it's funny because the way archivo, if the way I think about it, if I say vamos a archivar el caso, it might sound like let's just dismiss the case. It might let's just do away with it. Let's just put it in a file and forget about it. That's how it could sound, right? And I see in the chat a lot of answers here, and it's interesting because I see someter. That's actually and presentar. Those are the two most common ones that I see. Um, I try to use presentar because I think a lot of clients understand it really well, but Erika used another word, poner, like vamos a poner una demanda. Vamos a poner. I think sometimes it's the simplest ways of saying things. That's how clients would understand it. There's one that I haven't seen that I used once, and I went to law school in Puerto Rico, so when I first started, I would use a lot of legalese for everything. So I would say radicar. Well, radicar una demanda. And that word was problematic. I had a client where I was basically telling the client, you need to file the case in Seminole County, even though you live in Orange County. But the word that I used was radicar, and to her, from her country, it sounded like I was telling her that she needed to move. And we were there like back and forth. And to me, it was just simple, like, why? It's okay, you can file in that other county. That's the proper county. But this conversation was happening in Spanish, and she thought I was telling her that she needed to move to another county just to be able to pursue her claim. So that's where I learned I'm not going to use radicar anymore. I tend to use someter and presentar. But this is all part of what this is the reason that we do this, and we like to have this conversation because we do learn new meanings and new ways to doing things. So let's look at the next word. We have, sorry, it's not clicking. There we go. Court, simple one, right? Anybody want to drop in the chat how they would say court in Spanish? Erica, go for it. How would you say court in Spanish?
Tribunal or corte. I see Julia just posted that on the chat. I've used both of those. I've heard both of those.
I would say tribunal. I think it sounds that's how I would always call it when I was going to law school in Puerto Rico. But here I learned to use corte because I would tell people tribunal and they wouldn't necessarily understand. So
I think it
I know in
depends on
Puerto
how I'm
Rico too.
using it. Like go to court, vas a la corte, addressing the court. That's when I used tribunal more. I just kind of as practice of how I've done it before.
Right. Let's see what the next one is. We have landlord. This one, I guess we're going up a level. Erica, so you're telling your client that they need to talk to their landlord. What will you say?
I think because sometimes I find that the word slips my mind and I can't think of it. So I'll usually say the owner of the property, el dueño de la propiedad. I know when we were talking earlier, you know the precise word for it though.
I,
I see
it's
landlord
well,
on there too.
Vilma is using the one that I'm like I see in the chat, Vilma. Like that's sometimes I would say el landlord, and most people understand it. The and back in law school in Puerto Rico, they taught us arrendatario. Sorry, actually, arrendatario would be for the tenant. Arrendador would be for the landlord. One thing that they would always teach is like arrendador. The door sounds bigger, the tario sounds smaller. So in these type of relationships, you will look at arrendador, that's the landlord. The arrendatario, that would be the smaller person, which would be the tenant. That's unfortunately how they taught us, and it would sometimes count towards some of the others, but el landlord is the one that I tend to use a lot because most people understand it. And as Erica said, usually the owner of the property. It can be sometimes, you may have some circumstances where the owner is not necessarily the landlord. Maybe they have a different agent. But those are some of the terms that are used. And I kind of spoiled the next one, but the next one is tenant, which I've also used el tenant. So Erica, what would you call a tenant typically in Spanish?
Inquilino, and
Inquilino.
I see that in the chat too.
And I wonder, I mean, sometimes I would say inquilino, but I also have arrendatario. So I would just sometimes when I'm talking to a client in Spanish, I would say all the options. So maybe that's why some of my conversations tend to be a little bit longer because you kind of want to make sure that that you're giving the client the information in a way that they can understand. So this is one of my favorite ones. Erica, eviction,
Desalojo.
your desalojo. And I see here Jonathan already put in desalojo, desalojar. Yeah. There's another one that I've heard, which is desahucio. That one is that's another term that has been used. But if sometimes if I want to keep things simple, I will tell a client te van a votar, and it's kind of the slang way of saying it. And for some clients, if you may use the word desalojo or desahucio, they may not necessarily know what you're talking about, right? So desalojo seems to be the winner there. And this one is like an advanced level one, and I'm gonna be really honest. I don't think an actual translation for this one exists. If you maybe all of you have a better one for this. So, Erica, you're talking to a client, like maybe a dissolution of marriage case, and you're discussing equitable distribution. How would you bring this up in Spanish?
I would say the división de propiedad acumulada durante el matrimonio, the division of property accumulated during the marriage, when I'm describing it more and give examples, of course. But no, I think that's one I haven't attempted to precisely translate. But if anyone else
Okay.
has a better translation
Yeah.
online,
Oh, look at Gloria with división equitativa, distribución equitativa. If I were to say división de la sociedad legal de gananciales. I think I would just confuse the hell out of people. And that's basically in Puerto Rico what we typically call that term. It doesn't exist in Florida. That's basically how the law works in Puerto Rico. But if I were to use that term here with anybody, I don't think anybody would know what I'm talking about. So I kind of like how Erica described it. Sometimes just referring like propiedad matrimonial, deuda matrimonial. I think that's distribución de los bienes, distribución
yes,
equitativa. Those are really, really good ways to say it. And I have another one, which actually we just added this one right as like half an hour ago, probably, which is prenup. I'm wondering, like, if you were to tell somebody like, hey, do you have a prenup? Maybe you're discussing a good of distribution, and you ask, do you have a prenup? How would you ask that in Spanish? So, Erica, any ideas there? I'm seeing a lot of contrato
the one I
prematrimonial.
and please believe me, I don't know all the words. So if I need to look up
You know.
things, the way I've looked it up before is acuerdo prenupcial, because that's not one I had offhand, off memory.
So when I thought of the word, I had to Google like what the translation was. And it's funny because if I were to ask a client, I would say el prenup. It seems like that's my go-to, just do the Spanglish thing. But I know in Puerto Rico we would call it capitulaciones matrimoniales. So there's sometimes we have really complicated terms for really simple things, and the key is making sure that clients understand what you're talking about. But if I would have said capitulaciones matrimoniales, not even me, I went to law school in Puerto Rico, I probably wouldn't remember what it meant, so I would have to look it up. But I like Crisia's answer too, protegiendo tus bienes. So yeah,
Yeah.
there you go with the prenup. Okay, so I have other terms that I wanted to throw out there. These are some of these are going to be more of a curveball. A mobile home is one of my favorite ones because we know that a lot of people in the Hispanic community live in mobile homes. We see this a lot in, for example, in the Kissimmee area. And Erica, how would you say mobile home in Spanish? Like if you're talking to a client who's being evicted from a mobile home.
I've heard a lot of my clients describe it as trailer, um,
Later.
el trailer.
That's we see it in the chat. Some people are putting trailer, some people are putting casa móvil, which is,
Yeah.
it's always
I think
ironic,
I've
right? We talk
described it
about
as
mobile homes.
Casamobile, and they're like, "What?" And I'm like, "No, they're trailer."
Yeah.
Okay, so
I-
yeah.
Same here, guilty. I've used Casa Móvil and nobody knew what I was talking about. So trailer, it's a really common term that it's used for mobile homes. It's typically, sí, yo vivo mi trailer, but you know that they're talking about the mobile home. Injunction. This one is a little bit more, it may have different ways of saying it. So if you're dealing with a domestic violence survivor, if you tell them that they need to file an injunction, what word would you use for injunction?
Orden de protección is how I've described it.
Orden de protección. So, and that's where I find it interesting because orden de protección, it's the injunction for protection, right? Maybe I think one that I've used in the past, I'm trying to remember for injunctions, interdicto preliminar, it's like a mouthful. And some people may call it interdicto mandato. Actually, that's a pretty good one. But I think most people understand orden de protección. Decreto, that's a good one too. That sometimes I think we're looking at the order, so people may think, okay, we're getting the order, but this would be the petition to get the order. So I think most people go for orden de protección. And this is, I think I know I mentioned this one in the past in other webinars, but not a lot of people will know about this. But if any of you have a client and they are talking about child support and they mention asume, does anybody know what we're talking about with asume? Anybody in the chat? Feel free to drop it in. I know, Glorian, you probably know the answer. But if anybody in the chat knows what asume stands for, feel free to put it in there. We have taxes, maybe a little bit, but so I'm gonna give you the answer. Asume, that's basically DOR. I know Betsaida put CS for child support, but asume is basically the DOR in Puerto Rico. I remember what Asume stands for? It's a really long name. It's not even technically an acronym. But we can look it up later and drop it into the chat. But I wanted to bring it up because sometimes, knowing where people are coming from, if I assume that now I realize I'm saying assume for asume. If I assume that everybody calls it asume, I'm making a mistake because if I'm talking to somebody who's not from Puerto Rico, they're not gonna know what I'm talking about. The same thing with Ley 54, Law 54, and Carmen dropped it in the chat. Administración para el sustento de menores. That's how they compense asume, and it's basically DOR, child support enforcement. So that's where it could come up. And Ley 54, Law 54. Has anybody ever heard about Law 54? Anybody bring it up? It tends to come up in domestic violence circumstances. If you may hear from a client in Spanish say, le puse una ley 54, which almost literally translates, I filed a Law 54 case against somebody. And Crisia is answering, Law 54 is basically the domestic violence law in Puerto Rico. So when people refer to Ley 54, they're usually referring to an injunction similar to what we have in Florida. So I bring up these examples. We could just go on and on and on and have a million different examples. There's, as you've seen in the chat, there's like no perfect way of saying it, which is kind of the point of this webinar of ongoing education and ongoing conversations. Always make sure to ask, in the slides, I'm gonna have some additional resources, some glossaries that I found. From other states as well, and I feel like I'm always learning. I was preparing this presentation with Erica, and I learned a lot of new words that I don't think I had ever heard before, and that actually might be one of the next slides, which is this is going to be a really fun sentence to read out. I told my friend I lost my guagua while I was feeding the guagua before catching the guagua at guagua. So that's, I don't not see. I see already somebody say carro automóvil, which is Wawa for me. When I moved to Florida and somebody said Wawa, I'm like, where's the bus? Where's the car? Where is it? Where's the truck? And I had no idea they were talking about a gas station. But I see somebody put in child, and they might the Erica, are they correct? They said child.
Yeah, yep, I see child, I see baby. So yeah,
So,
one word can certainly have various meanings. I remember being in a client intake and I had not heard the phrase, I had never heard it used for a bus before. I was very confused when the client was telling me that we needed to speed it up because they had to catch the Wawa, which I mean, I assumed and I clarified and, you know, I got was able to understand what they were referring to. But in looking it up, I realized it could mean a baby, it could mean a bus, it could mean the Wawa that we now have accessible in Florida. I went to law school for my first year up in Pennsylvania, so Wawas were up there everywhere. But I also learned during the preparation of this slide that it's also an animal in Colombia. I had no idea. So Jorge was able to make that fun sentence for us.
you know,
But
I'm gonna use Wawa in every sense I can. So yeah, coche, yeah. I see somebody put in that reminds me of coche, baby stroller or vehicle. So yeah,
yeah, I just knew it as el bus, el autobús. I hadn't heard a Wawa before, but
yeah, it's something when I moved to Florida and I started using all these terms that we're used to in Puerto Rico. Like some people would look at me like, "What are you talking about?" And some people may be thinking that I'm talking about a child. Now that we learned that and I looked it up. It's mostly, I think it's Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cubans. I think we're the ones that refer to guaguas as buses. There's like a whole thing of why we call it that way. Then when I moved here and I saw a Wawa gas station, then I'm like, what's going on? Like people were telling me, let's meet up at Wawa. I'm like, what? Where's the truck? Where's the food truck? Like I had no idea what we were talking about, but I learned guagua as a child. It could be a child and it could be an animal from Colombia. So it's oh, I see that it could also be the bus route in other countries. So see, we're all learning new things here. And okay, so Erica, let's talk about like regional dialects, kind of wrap up this topic so we can move on to the next one. I know want to pass on this slide to you.
yes, of course. Really, the point of these slides was just to be mindful of regional dialects, and even if you are a native Spanish speaker, to know, it's okay to not know what certain words mean. Obviously, we may be able to get through most of the communication without any issue, but there may certainly be words that are going to come up. You also want to make sure you're aware of any cultural competency and the ability to interact effectively. I know there may be some I don't know if there was any misconception that this CLE would be held in Spanish either. So I'm hopeful that there are also bilingual attorneys on this presentation too, because we want to make sure that you're just aware that there are different cultures, there are different ways. You want to make sure that you're becoming aware of the cultural competency and the ability that it is going to impact the way you interact with individuals, what they may disclose to you, what they may be comfortable in sharing with you. You may have to work harder to build that rapport. There may be some inherent trust issues of, I don't know who you are, I don't know what your agency does. It may not be the most welcoming client right now for individuals of other countries and other cultures. So understanding that there may be some reluctance in sharing. They may know, you know I know that I need help. I know that you're an agency that a community partner told me I could trust, but you may still have to work at building that trust with them. So we just want to make sure we're aware of those issues, and also kind of keeping an eye on your interpreters as well. I think we talk about interpreters a little bit later, but knowing that one word may not necessarily be the same thing for another. I'm going to take this opportunity to bring up an example that I know isn't in one of the slides, but I remember being at a hearing, and this was when I was practicing in Virginia, and the only time I've spoken in Spanish in court was during this hearing because I needed to get clarification, and the judge definitely was like, "What is happening right now?" But my client was trying to explain a very graphic situation involving the domestic violence she experienced, where she did not consent to the sexual interaction, and she was trying to use certain words. But the word that she was trying to use, the body parts of the male, my interpreter was saying the hairbrush and not the male body part. And so I needed to get in there and get that clarification, because obviously those details were going to matter for purposes of the judge having a clear understanding of what had happened. So you want to make sure that you're check in with your clients too. If you are using interpreters, make sure that they were able to understand and communicate effectively, because just because you're requesting an interpreter of a specific language from an interpretation service, they may be encountering the very same issues. um, Sometimes my personal frustration is I'll hear, and I have to use interpreters for other languages that I don't know. I'll hear a lot of back and forth, and then the interpreter may tell me they said yes. And I'm like, can you tell me a little bit more about what transpired during that communication? I just want to make sure. It may have been the interpreter just getting clarification so they could understand or explain the question, but I just want to make sure I'm not missing any of those details, because if we need to call or get a different interpreter from a different region, we can do that. But we just need to make sure we're checking in and also making sure that we're not overlooking any of the possible regional dialect issues.
Let's go. I'm gonna
Um,
move on to the next slide because I know that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and
yes.
Erica, I want to keep it up with you.
Sure. No. So October is DV Awareness Month, and I will say that in terms of being aware of cultures, in the Hispanic cultures at least, my experience has been that what happens in the home stays in the home. There's certain things we just don't talk about, or that they're not comfortable. Our clients may not be comfortable in sharing. So you just want to be mindful of that. The fact that someone is even reaching out to you, anyone is reaching out to you regarding a domestic violence situation, is difficult. Adding in the layers of cultural cultural norms, I guess, that where we don't discuss certain things outside of the home, or there also may be certain things that have become normalized within that culture that now being here, now that they've come to the United States, they may realize, oh, some of these things that I grew accustomed to are actually outlawed here. I have the right to say no, or I don't have to be restricted to just staying in the home if my spouse doesn't give me permission to leave. Or there are certain things that you may have to, again, work at building that rapport, be patient in those communications and gathering those details, because there very well may be things that have become normalized in a sense for a specific culture that are very well illegal, or things that the person may have protections for here that they may not even realize. So we want to just be aware of those things, building that rapport, taking the time to ask those questions, explain why you're asking the questions too. I find that sometimes, even when it's not domestic violence related, I also handle some housing matters. So if I'm finding myself asking about mental health concerns and, how that might be relevant, if they might need a reasonable accommodation, let's say, um, I'll ask, generally, this may be a protection that might be available. I realize I'm asking very personal questions. This is the reason why I may be asking these questions. Taking similar steps with individuals where you may believe that there may be some of those cultural barriers may be helpful as well, just so that way they understand why you're asking, that it has a reason, that you're just not trying to be too invasive with respect to things that are going on within their home. Um, Additionally, for additional considerations, I know I've had some clients be very scared when they're talking to me about court fines or any possible debts. And sometimes it's easy to overlook the fact that in other countries, just like in other states, we have different laws. Other countries have very different laws. There may be some countries that definitely criminalize any sort of debt related issues. Debt imprisonment systems may still be in effect in the person's native country. So having a court cost, having any sort of demand letters for debts, that may be very scary to them for other reasons. So being patient with the individuals as they're explaining that to you, letting them know what their rights, their obligations may be, will certainly be helpful. Um, I know, Jorge, you were going to talk a little bit about the notarios as well.
Yeah, and adding on to, to that, I think it's one of the most common questions that we would get when I was talking to Spanish speaking clients about consumer debt. They're like, "Oh, I'm going to jail because of this. Can I go to jail?" I'm really like that was their main concern. Sometimes that's how we would have to start out the conversation with, first of all, you're not gonna go to jail over this, at least not here. So it was no, a normal part of the conversation. Now I wanted to bring up notarios because I think the U.S. is probably one of the exceptions, but in most countries, if you're a notary, then you're a licensed attorney. Like you cannot be a notary without being an attorney. So it's really common, specifically in South America and Latin America, for notaries to be attorneys. So when people see the term notary, they also automatically assume this level of protection, that they're licensed attorneys, that they're going to be able to do certain things that somebody else cannot. So there is a new bill in Florida addressing notario fraud. We are actually going to cover that bill in one of our upcoming webinars. So I'm not going to go super deep into it, but it's something to be mindful of. Sometimes people think that notary, is automatically an attorney. When I first moved here, I actually became a notary thinking it was gonna like, oh, that's gonna help me get clients because I'm a licensed attorney, but I'm also a notary, so that could help me out. Eventually, I just let it expire because I did not want to be a notary. When I realized I didn't really need it at all, but I did add some resources here that are I still need to update this information with the new bill, but this can be a big problem in Florida. You see a lot of people advertise themselves as notary. That's where that bill comes into play. So we see this a lot with immigration cases. We see it sometimes it basically could be unlicensed practice of law. We see this a lot with family cases where people need to get certain forms notarized. They go to a notary, and there's suddenly this notary is giving them all this legal advice on how to proceed, and mistakes are made, and it turns out that that notary is not an attorney. So they tend to charge less, so some people just use that as the excuse. So it's something to be mindful of. And I see it in the chat here, that yeah, and how people are able to, why notarios are able to scam so many people. Like there is that new bill, as I mentioned, that it does provide additional protections. So be on the lookout for that webinar. We're going to be discussing that bill. Specifically and us everything, we have that bill, so we want to make sure that it's being enforced. So if we need to call out these notarios that are committing notario fraud, how do we call them out and stop them from victimizing other people? So let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so we kind of touched on this a little bit, but it's a really popular topic when we're dealing with bilingual clients or LEP clients. It's the effective use of interpreters and bilingual staff. The most common one that we see, and I'm pretty sure everybody has seen this, whether it's a helpline call or a client meeting, and it's like, hey, can I use my family member or a friend as the interpreter? And I personally, I've always said I've avoided it. I'm not a fan of using family members or friends as interpreters. There's a lot of issues with that. There's undue influence. There could be issues with confidentiality, specifically if there's somebody else who's available to be the interpreter. I actually added one of like the ABA standard at the American Bar Association. They have the standards for the provisions of legal services, and they have a lot of great chapters and a lot of great guidance in there. They have one standard that is specific to language justice, and it even recommends that if you have somebody on your staff that speaks the primary language of your client, then that's the ideal person to talk to the client. And Erica, you probably see this a lot, so you want to chime in here with using family members or friends as interpreters?
I definitely don't do that just because a lot of my work is involving domestic violence, and there's so many things that a person may not be comfortable in sharing. They're not comfortable necessarily in sharing it with me, and they're not necessarily going to be comfortable in sharing it with more individuals and exposing more of the things that may be going on within their home. So I want to make sure, if possible, I'm getting the full story. From the onset, so I'm prepared as to how to address anything. But additionally, you just also want to be cautious with this when you're, let's say, reviewing a police report or an incident report, and kind of reviewing who got their story first to law enforcement. Did they have to wait on interpreters? Who interpreted for any of the individuals there? I would hope best practices, no one at the crime scene is translating for anyone there that was involved. Hopefully, we are getting proper translators so that way there's no influence of what was said or I would hope we've moved away from any of those practices, but be open to that. Ask those questions. Who was there? How were you able to communicate? Oh, if you had to communicate through the abusive partner to talk to law enforcement, that's not okay. So I know sometimes we're reviewing police reports and evaluating the victimization, and I know we may have some of those limitations within our grants, but I mean, please always use the interpreter services, and I avoid the family members and friends as interpreters. I know sometimes we even get clients who just say, I want this person in here with me for support, but as attorneys, we know we need to make sure we're providing them with the full uh, for them to be able to provide that informed consent of, what does this mean when you're allowing another individual into the conversation? And very similarly, I think there are even additional considerations when you're doing this with interpreters as well. Even
I
if it
think the
may be
first
necessary
time
to the communication, it's still not the best practice.
I think the first time this came up for me was it was in a state planning clinic, and it was basically the mother was the client, but the son was there, and the son wanted to be the interpreter. And the son was the one insisting, and it was really hard to separate them. Just that there was some undue influence there. Like you wanted to make sure that the client was alone so you could have that conversation. For me, it was possible because I spoke the language. So that's another example of how like it might not be the best idea to have that friend or that family member, even if they do have good intentions. You could end up doing more harm than good in those circumstances. In this slide, you see some of these are coming up blue or red. Those are hyperlinks. I'm going to share the slides with everybody. I also have a Google document with a lot of these resources as well. The Florida Court Interpreters link that will take you to the FO Court's website where it kind of provides general guidance on how and when to request interpreters. Typically, they will ask you, like, if you're going to court and you need an interpreter, they will ask you to request at least with 7 days notice. That may not necessarily be the case every single time, but that's kind of general guidance. And one specific rule that I heavily suggest you go through and read, it's Rule 2.560 of the Florida Rules of Judicial Administration. It's pretty long, and I'm not going to go into it, but it does cover a lot of a lot of material that could be helpful when it comes to requesting court interpreters, what exceptions there are, how to object in certain circumstances. So that's definitely a must read rule. So I was telling Eric, I remember one of my first times I was in court, like the security guard was actually called to be the interpreter. I don't know if they were certified or not. That at least in that scenario, they did. I was able to tell, like, okay, at least they are translating accurately, so I'm not going to object.
I agree with someone put in the chat about bilingual staff, and I think that's a lot to put on your staff because live interpretation of a conversation. I think if it's please call this client and relay this information, that's different because they're having a conversation in a language that they're comfortable in speaking. But that live interpretation is a skill. I think that that's certainly something that you should try to use interpretation services because I think the nature is to just find a shortcut. What's the shortest way that I can explain this thing? But we're lawyers. We use our words in documents. For example, I want to make sure all of the words are being translated in this retainer that I'm explaining to you. So if a if I have any concerns that this document is not going to be translated in full, I should be using the interpretation service. That my hope is that they have that expertise and the training and certifications to be able to do that live interpretation at that speed, at that quality, and be familiar with all those words and that we need to communicate.
Okay, so language access, this is really related to this topic, so we're gonna kind of keep this topic going. Something that I've always kind of called out, if you're familiar with the focourts.org website, they have a lot of self-help forms, and they're really common when we use them for family law, right? They have basically every possible form that you would ever need, even as whether you're a pro se litigant or an attorney, and every single form starts with instructions. Now, these forms are all in English, and they won't necessarily be all in Spanish when you're going to file them, but wouldn't it be great if we had these instructions in Spanish or have a form where we could walk a client through it and actually go paragraph through paragraph saying like, here's a version of this form in Spanish. So even though this is not the one that we will use to file, it would be great if you could follow this along. So maybe some of these resources already exist. I've added some examples here from the Ninth Judicial Circuit, where they do have some forms available in Spanish. And the reason I bring up the Ninth Judicial Circuit is that when we first did this presentation for the law students, it was in Orange County. So that's why we were pointing to the Ninth Judicial Circuit, but it doesn't mean that other circuits may have similar resources. So um, this is another example of an organization that has a lot of documents and resources that have already been translated. So in the past, I've been guilty of trying to translate everything from scratch rather than look at what other resources may already exist. So this is another example of how some of these somebody already took the time to translate resources. These are links from a webinar that we had last year for Hispanic Heritage Month. And I wanted to include these here because they are still relevant and these are great examples of the type of resources that we do have available. And here I have another ABA standard that I like to quote. And I Googled some of these Spanish legal glossaries. And I was curious and I looked at a few of these. And it's funny because sometimes you would find one word I was looking for one word and I would look at all of them and they would have a different translation. So these are great to look at if you're curious as to how to, certain terms what's the correct meaning or what's the correct translation. Those are some example glossaries. I promise you there are more. I'm hoping that one day we have one in Florida. Maybe it does already exist and I haven't found it, but that would be like a long-term goal to be able to put this type of glossary together. And one of the topics that probably not everybody's favorite topic, but professional responsibility and ethics, we kind of wanted to include this. And I could have like a list here of dozens of rules that could come into play, but the rule that really stands out is communication. A lawyer must explain matters to the extent reasonably necessary for the client to make informed decisions. And Erica hit on this earlier on this topic, making sure that your client really understands. There's a great Florida Bar article that I included in the materials. It's called What We Got Here is Failure to Communicate, the Legal, Ethical, and Monetary Considerations of Effective Communication. It was written by Matthew Dietz in 2022. So I'll include it in the materials. Make sure to give it a read because it's a great article that really breaks down um, this obligation to properly communicate with clients. And we look at the ethical and the professional responsibility side of things, but I did add other guidance that I found, in particular the Department of Justice guidance when it comes to, we are legal aid programs. So we must provide language access, including written translations of vital documents for LAP clients. So it does mention like, while private lawyers aren't bound, it is best practice still, so you want to make sure this sets that benchmark that if you have a client that speaks another language, whether you're required to or not, ideally you would provide documents in their translated into their primary language. And we kind of tried to break it down as best practices. And there was that term of vital documents, like whether it's retainers, client rights notices, waivers, settlement releases. I was having this conversation with Erica, and I would always have, as an example, I would talk to a client in Spanish about an eviction or a family law matter. And I would always have a follow-up email in Spanish or in their language that I would email them right after our call. And this is kind of going to that fourth bullet point, which Erica hit on as well. It's making sure that the client understands, not just getting a simple acknowledgement. I'm guilty of this a lot. A lot of times I will say, yes, I totally understood. I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying. Um, and I'm not sure if this is me being Latino, if this is something we all do, but sometimes with clients, you may want to take that extra step or allow them that extra time to maybe ask them like, hey, like, what's the next step? What did you take away from all of this, right? So, and Erica, do you want to add here because I know you're actually the one that brought this up, so I wanted to kind of pass it on to you.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say I know sometimes, I mean, even when we're not translating documents, I think sometimes we'll just say, here is a document, let me know if you have questions. But I think it's still important to go through that document, whether or not your client is speaks a separate language or not. Even with my clients that I'm communicating with in English, I'm going to go through a document if it's a settlement agreement, if it's a stipulation, anything. If I'm filing anything, I want to make sure I have everything as accurate as possible. I try not to rely too much on the client saying, yes, I understood it, or no, for the reason that Jorge said. I want to make sure you read it and that we understood this. And if it's in a different language, I don't want to be part of the problem. If part of our defense is our client didn't understand what they were signing, I don't want to be part of the problem and making my client sign something that they didn't understand. So I want to make sure that we're taking the time to translate that. If it's a document that they have to have notarized, I don't want them to say you understand what you're signing and they just say yes. I want them to actually understand what they're signing and know what they're signing and know what they're bound by. I think, Jorge's summary and writing is a great idea. I know sometimes we're in a very fast-paced environment, so you may not get that opportunity to do that at every single juncture, every single communication, but at least make sure that interpreted communication, that you're taking the time. We already have the interpreter on the phone. May as well continue and translate and make sure everything is well understood, that I'm explaining everything that I can to my clients in Spanish. If I'm using words that are not the words that they're familiar with, and we're still speaking Spanish as we were going through in our earlier slides, then let's make sure we're on the same page about what my interpretation of WAWA was versus what your interpretation of WAWA was in this documentation, as an example. It's just part of our obligations. We want to make sure we're communicating effectively, and we, again, don't want to be part of the problem that we're trying to solve in that case.
Christy put in the chat, I think explaining and summarizing is so important even in English, right? This
Yeah.
applies every single time. I think there are a lot of people out there who cannot read at all or cannot read well. So it's just kind of due diligence, right? Making sure that our clients understand. It just goes to that duty of communication. Okay, so this was part of what we took away when we were talking to the law students. I think this was back in April. We were really trying to encourage them to volunteer, but as we have this conversation, a lot of this has to do with ongoing education. That's where this title comes from, right? Debí tomar más CLEs. I should have taken more CLEs. I should have done more for education. And if you know me, I will talk for 8 hours, and this would be a never-ending topic. I love this topic, and we just kind of wanted to put out there this opportunity, where to find resources, how to improve and hone your skills, and I have to plug the Florida statewide training, the Florida Legal Services Statewide Training Initiative channel. So we have our YouTube channel. We have a lot of great trainings in there, and one of them is about cultural competency that was done by my colleagues here at FLS. And Erika, I wanted to pass it on to you to talk about that cultural competency training and outreach events and how this could be used for honing these skills.
Sure. Within FLS, we have great, talented individuals, and two of our attorneys, Daphne Guillaume and Ann Purville, they've been working to overcome any of the distrust within the Haitian community, to make sure that they know we are a resource, and who the community partners are out there that may be resources for individuals. They did provide a cultural competency training that I believe is in the library that Jorge linked. But I also wanted to know outreach. I know that maybe not all of our grants have that requirement with respect to doing outreach, but I think if you want to be familiar with a community or see how things may transpire or how things may work, get out there and go to those outreach events. I'm sure I've seen a lot of the legal aid agencies at different events throughout the state. I think that it's very important for the community to know who we are. And I know that Anne and Daphne, just to plug them again, I know last year they had put together a holiday resource outreach event, so that way members in the community could just come out and, as part of celebrating the holidays and maybe having an opportunity to have fun games and food and pick up a toy for their child, they may also get to know who the agencies were in the Orange County area that may be able to serve if you happen to be the victim of a crime. Building that trust and building and extending that olive branch, so that way people know who you are, where to find you, that we are a trusted agency. I think that that's a way to build that rapport and move forward with how to build that bridge within the communities that you serve.
And I added other opportunities for growth here. One of my favorite ones is networking. I use that empanadilla icebreaker a lot. Even whether you're recruiting volunteers, pro bono attorneys, law students, it's a great way to practice these skills, to learn from other cultures as well. I have the public interest law section here. We have a lot of these events, and it just happens now that for pills, for law students, it's free. So if you're a law student, they can join for free. And this is a great way. I was mentioning earlier how those self-help forms under focourse.org, they're all in English and there's no instructions in Spanish, then maybe that's the type of project where we can recruit volunteers for, right? And work with other associations. So I know we're like 5 minutes away from wrapping up, so I want to go through the last few slides. And here, I've mentioned pro bono opportunities. October happens to be pro bono month. We do have a panel, and the people that know me, I'm always going to find a way to include Leonel Messi into my presentation. But I wanted to ask one final question for the audience. Umbrella. How would you say umbrella in Spanish? We see here Messi's holding an umbrella. So, how would you say umbrella in Spanish? We have sombrilla. Okay, so sombrilla. We have impermeable. Oh, I don't think I've ever okay, we
Paraguas.
have paraguas. So, Erica, what will you call it, Erica?
I've always said paraguas.
Okay, so I say sombrilla. A lot of people say paraguas. It's funny when I googled sombrilla, it was more one of those beach umbrellas rather than the typical sombrilla. But it's funny, Glorian. I've never thought about it that way, and you may be right. Paraguas is one of the really big ones, and sombrilla is the small one. I don't know. But I brought this up because you may be familiar with some of our umbrella groups, and I was jokingly like, do we create like an umbrella group, and do we call it the sombrilla umbrella group, or do we call it the paraguas umbrella group? I don't know. But the what we kind of wanted to go into here is maybe keeping this conversation going. And I still don't have a date for this. Maybe just creating like a cafecito break where we have an open meeting, not like a CLE, not recorded, but just having this conversation where people can join and bring up like, hey, here's what we're seeing in the community. Here's what worked. We found this great resource. So I'm probably gonna come up with a date, maybe something closer to 4 months from now. Maybe 4 months is a good time to prepare and learn. So with that said, I'm really hoping that you're all ready for the Super Bowl halftime show. Maybe we can come up with a meeting prior to this so we can probably prepare and maybe prepare for the show. Maybe we can do a post show. And 4 months may be enough. So I'm gonna come up with a date and I'll drop it in there. Maybe we can do like a 3 p.m. Type of meeting where if it works out, maybe we can do it quarterly. We could come up with ideas and ways on how do we communicate. Like if I have a document that I may need and I want to ask the community like, hey, does anybody have a translated version of this document? That way you don't have to start from scratch. So with all of that said, we only have 2 minutes, so I want to make sure I share the CLE code. The CLE code is 2508985N as in Nancy. So that's technically the last slide. We still have a few minutes, so if anybody wants to like come off mute or raise their hand or drop questions into the chat, comments, I see here that when I was in law school, LLSA hosted a couple of cafecito rooms tailored to whatever needs came up. That would be awesome to host. So yeah, anybody that wants to help put this together, feel free to email me. I love doing this webinar. We've done versions of this webinar before. I think, Erica, how many presentations have we done together as part of our Oracle Law team?
How many have we
Awesome.
done together, or how many have you let me speak? These are very two different ones.
Yeah, that's another issue for another day, right? But yeah, I love presenting with Erica. These
Jorge's
are always
correct. He
really
could
fun.
talk to you by himself. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to join you, Jorge, because you really did not need me. But I'm happy that we were able to have this conversation. I do think it's important to just be aware and, kind of, I think we all in practice know what we should do, but it's important to have these conversations. I would welcome an opportunity to have a cafecito, and I'm glad we were able to meet together and join our colleagues across the state. So thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everybody that joined us here today. This was really fun, as expected. So let's keep the conversation going, and everybody have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.